All right, so thanks everyone for taking the time to be here today. Welcome to today's event. This is Building Evaluation Capacity of an Organization in Times of Turbulence, and we are with Bob Lahey today. I'm Evan Ponsley, the IT chair for CES Nova Scotia, and I'd just like to touch on a few things before we get going. First, I'd like to acknowledge that the Nova Scotia chapter of CES is in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq First Nation. We do invite you to keep this in mind during today's session and reflect on how the presentation content could help us to better serve Indigenous populations as well as other historically excluded populations. I also have just a few technical things to go over. First of all, please keep your mics muted during the presentation just to ensure audio quality. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. So in the meantime, feel free to use that chat at the bottom, put in any questions, comments, chat with one another, go for it. And one of the biggest questions we always get is, will slides be available? Yes, slides will be available and will be posted in the coming days. And we'll notify people about that. And lastly, as you may have noticed, today's session is being recorded. So that's all from me. I'll pass things over to Karine Chater to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Evan. I speak for Maria Tendencia, the co-chair of PD and the whole PD committee, to say we're extremely pleased to have Bob Lahey with us today. I'll just give you a point of context. After he agreed to this presentation, I learned he was told to have a draft of his chapter for a book to the editor by the end of March. Oh yeah, but he stuck with his commitment to us. But I think we asked him just in time, so be grateful. So a couple of things about Bob. Bob was the first executive director of the Center for Excellence in Evaluation, which was created by the Treasury Board Secretariat. So he was very active in the development of evaluation plans for our nation, really. And he has been very generous in sharing his ideas. For every CES conference, he organizes an interesting panel and he recruits those who he thinks can contribute. Now, I'll tell you, I always attend any presentation that he gave at a CES meeting because then I would know what to think for the next year. Until such time, the next year when he gave another presentation, then I would say, okay, this is what I have to think from now on. So he didn't know he was being stalked. But when Bob left TBS, he undertook international consulting, working for a number of countries, usually designing their countrywide evaluation plan. And he is in demand by international agencies. His work is very well respected by World Bank and UN agencies, and they're listed in our poster. Bob is a fellow of CES, and after becoming a fellow, he tried to inject some organization and purpose into the group of fellows. He created a fellows executive group, and he has chaired that brilliantly for 5 years. So thank you, Bob, for agreeing to be part of our professional development program. And over to you.
Thanks, Karine, and thank you for those nice words. And it's great to be here. I should say I have a really strong connection and feelings to Nova Scotia and the East Coast. I've mentioned this to you before, Karine. I have my mother is from Nova Scotia, and lived in different places and moved westward to Ottawa with her family when she was a young girl. But she always referred to herself as a blue noser. So it's always I always think of that. And my wife and I had mentioned this to Evan yesterday when we were chatting. We are anxiously awaiting for the bubble to burst in the Atlantic provinces so that we Ontarians and others can, but my wife and I in particular, can come and visit Nova Scotia, PEI, New Brunswick, and the Rock, because we love all of those areas. The other thing that I should also mention is I am wearing a suit, which I have not done for a long time. I bought this suit just before the pandemic hit and have never worn it. So I thought this was an appropriate occasion to pull out the jacket, no tie, but let me get started on this. It's a relatively long presentation, and I'm going to run through it fairly. Okay, let's see, fairly quickly, because as Evan said, we'd like to have time for questions at the end. So you will have the slides. So there are a couple of slides that are pretty heavy in terms of content, and I'll be running through those quickly. Well, words of our times, you know, we are seeing these words constantly. Evidence-based decision making. And as an evaluator, I love to see these words, but over time, I'm starting to question at times how they are being used. And I also ask, well, what is it we mean by evidence as they're being used? Well, in times of COVID, and this is the elephant in the room. We can't be talking about evaluation capacity building and not say, well, hey, just a minute, we're living in times of a pandemic. Does it even make sense to be talking about evaluation capacity building? Well, I think it does, at least to be reflecting on it. What evidence that people who are responsible for responding to COVID-19 are drawing on it, it has tended to be mathematical modeling, risk assessment, a few select health indicators. But there's a question, and that is this adequate? And I would say no. People are having to respond quickly, but we also have to remember that there's different dimensions of evidence and knowledge. It's not singular. So areas such as social, cultural, behavioral information, on the ground knowledge, would these help? And in fact, where much of this becomes the lifeblood of evaluators, can evaluators play a value-added role in going forward? Well, I would say, yes, this can help, but I'm going to qualify my yes when I answer the question, can evaluators play a value-added role? Yes, but. And so what is that but? What's rattling around in my brain? And really what I think we need to, as evaluators, to understand is the broad context, and remember, reflect on, it's not business as usual. If any of you linked into, there were a couple of webinars from the CES National Capital Chapter over the last 2 or 3 weeks, and they were talking, there were presentations that reflected the experience of 3 departments, FAC, Public Health Agency of Canada, National Research Council, and ESDC. And they were very timely, they were well done, and they talked about the not business as usual, being aware of the changing priorities, the needs of the organization, government having changed, addressing the questions that needed to be addressed and not being limited to the focus and the scope of traditional evaluation. And a key one, being nimble in both the practice and the approach in providing information that's going to be just in time and meeting these changing needs of senior officials. Not only are things moving quickly, there's the unknown that one has to deal with. And so certainty is something that, and lack of certainty, that evaluators have to get used to. But now bringing it closer to evaluation capacity and evaluation capacity building, really, I think what those not business as usual observations reflect on, at least in my mind, is thinking and operating within a broad systems context when we're thinking about evaluation. And I would say, I'm going to speak to work I've done internationally at a country level, at a national level, work I've done here in Canada at the federal organizational level. But this is reflective of any organization, any province, any country. So one can be thinking at all of those levels, thinking about evaluation in this broader systems context. And when I use the word systems, I'm not talking about an IT systems. I think there is a tendency to gravitate, certainly internationally, try and gravitate to the IT solution far too quickly before they've actually identified and developed in a comprehensive fashion, really what, as an engineer might say, what the system looks like. Focusing on both the supply evaluation, the products, the services, and the demand and the use for evaluation. So here we are, we have supply and demand. Part of my background is as an economist. So you'll say, oh, here he goes. Well, it's this is almost like a market. We have supply and demand, and the two in effect collectively define a market. So that's a concept, but it certainly goes well beyond that. The other thing you would notice here is I've got a little box for M and a little box for E. And why am I doing that? Well, I'm doing that because very often, first of all, the M and the E are, the M is performance measurement / monitoring. The E is the ad hoc systematic evaluation that delves deeper into trying to understand performance, where the M may be providing a trend analysis or a cross-sectoral type of observations. The E is plummeting further. Very often when I'll be talking about senior officials, political officials, they gravitate to the M because it's easier to work with. It's typically faster, but the expectations get set, I think, far too high and unrealistic in terms of being able to understand situations. But, and so I think it's important both for the raising awareness and understanding of how to capture and evidence and how to use it, is to reflect on both the M and the E, but also to remember that they are complementary. So these are not at odds with one another. So for thinking this is an evaluation system, where is the focus generally placed when we talk about evaluation capacity building? Typically, it's on supply. What do we have to do? Well, we have to train evaluators. We're going to train evaluators, and now we're going to have an evaluation system. But as I say later on a slide, good evaluation is not enough. If there's not a market for it, if there's not users for it, you might be considered as fine academic individuals, but are you providing what is needed, when it's needed, etc.? Maybe yes, maybe no, but you better reflect on that demand and use. But I'm going to take this further and say, well, I think the system is broader than simply those two elements, the technical capacity to supply and the capacity within the system to demand and use monitoring and evaluation information. Those two are very important, but there's two, what I've called two overarching influences: political will, which is commitment, leadership, resources, and then the other, which are the technical factors more aligned with the supply and the demand. but go beyond that. Out of this, then what I'm saying is we essentially have 4 building blocks. The supply one, the demand, but we have a building block that is, I've referenced the vision and commitment of leadership, and another one, which is the enabling environment, which may be additional institutional factors, but it may be more than that. It probably is more than that. So if we look at that diagram of supply and demand, now we've got more boxes. We've got these 4 boxes, which I am now saying are the 4 building blocks of the evaluation system. And you see, I still have the M and the E there. The utility of this, at least in my mind, is then if you want to think about what is needed for evaluation capacity building, you're doing far more than simply looking and thinking about training evaluators, or even thinking about the internal supply and demand. You're going well beyond that and thinking about vision, commitment of leadership, enabling environment, these other institutional factors. So that's the concept here that I'm working with. And what I want to do now is to give you a little bit of discussion about how I've actually used this. So going from concept to reality, how do we operationalize this? And here I should say I'm running through this fairly quickly. I have 6 references at the end where you can dig into much more detail and get a better understanding. So within the context of an hour and time for questions, we're not going to delve all that deeply, but we have this framework that is taking this broad, comprehensive approach to the notion of evaluation capacity building. I didn't say M&E capacity building, I'm talking evaluation capacity building. And for each of those 4 building blocks, what we have, and I've identified critical success factors and key considerations for success. And I put these key considerations in the form of questions. Now, when you get around to looking at what I have written in papers or chapters in books, you may say, well, look, some of these questions I don't think are relevant, or, well, really, it's not intended as a one-size-fits-all. It's intended as a guide. And it's a guide to looking towards that point that I would call success. Your system, your M&E system that is effective and sustainable. And what is useful here in terms of this framework with all of these key considerations for success is if they all applied, what this is defining implicitly is an ideal end state, a comprehensive evaluation system. Nobody has this. It's a frame of reference that is useful in helping identify where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses, where are the gaps in terms of whether it's the organization, whether it's a province, whether it's a country, thinking about the capability to evaluate. So here are just, I've used this term consideration for success. So here's some examples that might be associated with the building block vision and demonstrated commitment of leadership. And I said, these are all in the form of questions. So are political and senior officials aware of the importance of monitoring and evaluation? I also mentioned results-based management, good governance, management practice, their role and importance. Are there champions for monitoring and evaluation, or evaluation at a political, senior, operational level? The last 2, I'm not going to read through each of these, but the last 2 I think are quite interesting because this sometimes is really where the rubber hits the road. Is there a willingness and ability to challenge the status quo and current culture within organizations? Does leadership allow transparency and foster accountability in public sector management? So this is public sector I'm talking about. I used this approach in several countries where they were all developing countries in one way or another, up to the level of a middle income country. And in all the cases, these last two became particularly important because what became apparent was that senior leadership wasn't willing to challenge, and they weren't allowing transparency. And it brought the whole exercise to a halt. But there were other occasions where that was the case, and I've identified 3 countries. So the capacity to demand and use M&E information in some of the examples I give, key considerations for success. What is driving an M&E initiative? And part of that then relates also to, is there clarity around where, how the information can be used? Planning, management, budget, reporting. As I think we all know, oftentimes senior officials think of evaluation in a one-dimensional sense, and they don't necessarily reflect on, and often, unfortunately, that one dimension is to think of the accountability and align it with internal audit. And accountability is an important word, and it's part of the repertoire, but learning and knowledge become increasingly important and are unfortunately often overlooked when the word evaluation is used. One of the things, it's right in the middle. Are there adequate accountabilities and incentives within organizations to ensure the use of monitoring and evaluation information? Are there carrots and sticks? And that's an interesting one. That's an important one. And one of the references that I have at the end is a paper I did for the World Bank on the federal evaluation system, lessons learned from 30 years. And I think I've included it because even though it's a decade old, it's still relevant in many respects. There's lessons, and I think it's interesting to identify and see some of the carrots and sticks that have been put into play within the federal system, just to in effect ensure that evaluation is on the radar screen. So I've made reference to using this framework, and they're 2 very different environments. So it's the same concept of the 4 building blocks. And the first use has been in this broad organization or governments that have little or no evaluation capacity. So that what I'm saying here, and the reason I put this up, if you, for example, wanted to look at Nova Scotia, the provincial government, and said, do we have a lot of evaluation that's being ongoing? And I think the answer is not as much as you would hope or would like. And maybe that's an overly generous statement, but I'll leave that to you to decide. You could be using this to identify major areas for evaluation capacity building. It then becomes the basis for a strategy, and I say multi-year plan for developing an evaluation capability. The examples where I've used this and everything rolled out: Botswana, country just in Africa, just north of South Africa, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana in South America, on the border of the Caribbean. Interestingly, in all cases, the senior officials wanted to roll this out quickly. They wanted something that would have a system in place in 1 year, roll it out as a whole of government. And I resisted that. And basically my advice was, if you try that, given the limited amount of evaluation capacity that currently exists, you're going to overwhelm the system. You're giving this a recipe for failure. So start in a modest way. And my suggestion, start with 2 or 3 ministries within the government. And I'm mentioning this because it could be a formula, for example, for any province. If you start with the ministries where there may be some life force of evaluation, and typically, and this is true of countries in general, typically they would be in education, health, they may be in some form of social service ministry. If you're thinking at a country level, it's often in agriculture, because agriculture is a ministry is very data rich. And use those examples as a way to, in effect, build, experiment, and try and move through the development, ultimately, so that it becomes not only a lesson learned for the rest of the system, but you can hopefully use the leadership of those ministries as champions to carry it further. The second area, evaluation function, exists, and there's a track record. And this was the case where we had the federal government carrying out neutral assessments of department evaluation function. This was a requirement that came in the 2009 federal evaluation policy, was retained in the 2016 policy on results. I think it was a very, very good addition, because what it allowed for was a conversation with senior officials. And I'll speak to how it got applied, but it was essentially the same 4 building block model. Quickly, and I better move on because I'm trying to keep track of time here. At the country level, so this is going back to the first use, where the approach that I had taken was to carry out what I had called a needs or ready assessment. It's essentially, what is the current reality, and using the template of the key consideration for success as really it was the lines of inquiry in terms of broad consultation with stakeholders in all sectors to really identify the strengths, weaknesses, and gaps, because this would help then in articulating potential practical entry points. So when I say broad consultations, at a country level, I would be approaching public sector, private sector, what internationally they would refer to as civil society, academia, other research organizations, etc. So it's really to identify a very broad lay of the land. And I think the world that we have been in and will be in going forward really demands that broad consultation in linking to where evaluation makes sense to other areas. So out of this, a strategy and an action plan to strengthen the M&E system. As I said, it would be typically multi-year. I'm only going to spend a couple of a minute or two on this and the next slide. This is using the framework within the context of that neutral assessment of evaluation. So here's a case where an organization has an evaluation function, it has a track record. So why are you doing this? What you want to do are to identify the performance. Are there areas where there's a need for improvement? And it may not be simply an improvement in evaluation practice. It may be a need for the organization to step up. So that's why when you look at this, I've made reference to it, there's not only professional practice standards implicit here, but we have department-wide standards. And the words here are reflective of those 4 building blocks. So I'm going to not say anything more. Now, the next slide, I have to warn you, there's a lot of color and it's far too busy for a presentation, but I wanted to show this. Okay, so it's what this is. This was basically how I ultimately presented results of those neutral assessments. The 4 broad areas that are reflective of the building blocks, and then underneath each we have the areas that I examined, and those areas underneath each reflect in part what the standards and expectations of the policy on evaluation was requiring, but I broadened it within this broad context. I should say, I mean, I really don't like this type of approach in simply presenting, but it proved to be very useful because it gave senior officials just a very comprehensive shot and a reflection that it's not just the evaluators that this all rests on. It's senior officials themselves in terms of ensuring that there is an environment and a capacity and resources. So the last thing I'll say here is that in terms of performance rating, what I did was I used the traffic light. So I had green for well-performing. Each of those rows would be either well-performing, which would be green, some issues, which would be yellow or orange, and red would be at risk. And in the 5 agencies, federal agencies, where I carried out the neutral assessment, they all basically came through very green, but there were some areas where there was yellow, and there were a couple of cases where there was some red. What it did with this broad mapping was it focused immediately on those areas where there was a need for attention. And as I say, it was frankly quite generally in the area where senior officials had to do some stock taking themselves. So just a couple more slides here. Some important considerations. If we stand back, we talk about the framework. If we think about evaluation capacity building, there's a broad set of players that are involved. If we want to think of a system that's going to be effective and sustainable, in terms of capability and building, it's not just about building the supply side, but it's also thinking about building the capacity to actually use information in decision-making. The statement I made earlier, good evaluations are not enough. So in moving in that direction, what is required in many cases is an awareness raising of senior officials. It's not just about technical training, because one needs champions, and they reside right at the start with senior leadership. And depending on what we're talking about, maybe the political support even higher. Within the system, the use is going to be encouraged or demanded by incentives. This is the carrots and sticks. But we know our world is getting more complex. We're working across programs, we're working horizontally across organization. So communication, partnerships, very, very important. In thinking, and these are things that in one way or another, as I listened to those 3 departments over the last 2 or 3 weeks, where they talked about the use of evaluation and what worked well during these pandemic times, so many of these elements just resonated with me. Evaluation capacity building, one has to put a reality check often with senior officials. It's not done instantly. It's not simply a technical issue. It's long-term, it's iterative. And really quite important, this is not one size fits all. Every situation is unique. So last couple of slides, I just wanted to drive home what I think is really an important point that historically has gotten overlooked. So the first is, say, the demand side of the evaluation framework. Who are the clients? What are their needs? And increasingly, and especially over the last year, the importance of looking at both the micro and the macro level. So I'm showing here, if we were talking about a public sector, I'm saying, well, there's 4 levels, and I'll show it on this diagram. 3 of them are internal, if this is a public sector. The deputy head is thinking both internal and external. And external, you've got not only the politicians, you have special committees, but you also have the general public in on areas such as pandemic. So going forward, this is my last message to leave with you, and that is to take or create the opportunity to communicate and consult with senior officials. And I'm saying this to each one of you, and I'm saying this to your chapter, and I'm saying this to CES National. Take or create the opportunity to communicate and consult with senior officials. Why is that? Well, if there's too little evaluation, what is needed is to raise the awareness and understanding with the political and senior levels about, and I've mentioned here, there's ambiguity, there's lack of clarity, and this business of competitive tools, there is, I think, a need to really have some good and honest discussions with officials, if that's feasible, about the pros and cons of these various things. We have evaluation, we have performance measurement / monitoring. We have, and I've said, flavor of the month. Well, at the federal level, we had deliverology, which was brought in from the, I came into contact with deliverology over in Botswana, and I saw the same gang bringing it into Canada, and and it's been used at a provincial level as well. You need to have those honest conversations. In areas where there already is evaluation, where there is a track record, you can't sit back, you can't lie in the weeds. It's important to be assessing the effectiveness and contribution of evaluation. One needs to be proactive, and that's why I say either take or create the opportunity, because our world is changing. Even if we didn't have pandemic, our world would still be changing. My 32 years in government were always reflective of change management, and that's happening exponentially in the world that we're in right now. Probe and understand where and how evaluation is being used and contributing, what can be done to improve the practice of evaluation, the utilization of evaluation by those officials, and final word, incorporate a forward-looking lens into the consultations, because it's not simply lessons learned through the rear view mirror. It's lessons learned in this broad context, what's important in that, in looking forward. And that emphasizes the importance of having that broad context and having the antenna up to understand, or try to understand, in this world of uncertainty, what's ahead. So that's it. I've got 6 references here. 5 of them I wrote. The 6th is the CJPE article, and it reflects the work that was done. As it turns out, National Research Council of Canada. I developed the framework, which essentially was built on the 4 building blocks, and then carried out the assessment. And the NRC folks took the lead on that, and I was a contributor in terms of the article per se. So I'm just going to flash 2 of those 6. The first is a paper that I did for United Nations Evaluation Group, National Evaluation Capacity Development. And I'm highlighting this. You can get this and the next, if I can get all of these off the web. It's the practical tips on how to strengthen evaluation systems. I think there's useful information there. And the other one, this is the oldest paper that I put out here. There's still some very relevant lessons learned. Some of it is buried throughout the description, but the other part is right at the end. So if people have questions, we have, I think, about 20 minutes for questions, but if we go beyond that, I'm leaving my coordinates. Karine also knows how to contact me, so by all means, you can get in touch. So let me stop there, and I'll pass it back to Karine and Evan.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Robert, Bob. I get them mixed up sometimes.
They all work. They all work.
Yeah, gotcha. All right, thank you very much. So as you mentioned, we do have time for questions. So if people do have questions, feel free to type them in the chat here, or if you want to ask them yourself, you can unmute, ask away, or raise your hand and we can call on you, whatever suits you best.
And if you don't have any questions, I have a suggestion for the chapter.
Sounds good. I see Nancy has put her hand up, so take it away, Nancy.
Thanks, Evan. Are you shocked that I'm the one that wanted to get in there with a question first? I'm sure you are. Bob, this is fantastic and really useful. I left a comment there about how helpful I actually found your very colorful slide as a discussion tool for looking at culture and sustainability of evaluation. But I was actually attending another webinar this morning where they were talking about monitoring and evaluation for sure, but also the way that, and I agree with you, it's whether there was going to be a pandemic or not, we could see some of the changes that were happening in terms of the use and demand for evaluation. And there was discussion about going beyond, traditional monitoring of what is happening and evaluation of what happened to looking at predictive questions like what will happen. And then beyond that to transformative questions of how can we change what will happen and what happens. And in listening to that, I was thinking, oh, that is so true in the worlds that I'm in, where sometimes I find in terms of people who are going to, you have an evaluation team maybe, and people aren't using evaluators to the full scope of their capacity. Like we have lots of evaluation methods and approaches like developmental or principled approach. There's all kinds of case studies and things like that, and approaches that we could use to actually answer some of those questions around transformative change. And I think it's also important that we start recognizing that what leaders are needing are to answer questions that are somewhat predictive, because the cycles are like things are moving so quickly. And this idea of transformative evaluation, like how can we know or how can we change what will happen? I see the research world wanting to go there and talk about, and answer some of those predictive questions. But I also think that there's opportunity for evaluators if their capacity is built in the comprehensive way that you've suggested in your framework. I think it's on us as well to help end users of evaluation understand that we can answer those types of questions using our methods and approaches as well. Any thoughts on that? Is that something that's coming up for you as well? Like the
the term the chapter that I'm working on that Karine mentioned is the focus is the impact of COVID on the use of evaluation with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. So things such as what you're referring to are very much a part of that. Now, the question, you know, there's several questions here and there's several thoughts and comments. So I'll just throw out a couple, but the term evaluative research is a term that I think we see increasingly. And so that in my mind, the forward-looking approach that I mentioned, you know, right, the last thing I mentioned, which was to always make sure that you have a forward-looking approach. That's something, quite frankly, I've always had in my mind, but a lot of evaluators do not think that way. A lot of senior folks aren't necessarily looking for that. Is it because they're not aware? I think to a very large extent, there's a real information gap between what evaluators think they can do and deliver on and what senior officials know about evaluation and perceive as how it might be used. There's this gap. So that's an important one to address. But some of this rests also on the shoulders of evaluators. And part of it, I think, comes back to how do we train, how do we grow our evaluators? And I think we've moved in a direction. So, you know, I've been around the community for a long time. And the community started, there were no formal program evaluation courses. I came out of university with degrees in math and economics, so I had a pretty good social science method skill set, which was very useful for research. And what came along, so now I'm really dating myself, what came along was the formality of systematic evaluation. And I loved it because it was using those research methods in much more practical terms than what might be called research or policy research, which was always looking so far ahead that you never got there. Whereas it tended to be more contained. What we have now is we have formal evaluation training. And so I think one of the things that has to happen is that we need to make sure that whatever is being serviced by way of training and orientation to the evaluation, new and emerging evaluators in particular, but the evaluators generally, is reflective of the world as it moves. And it's not caught in this looking in the rear view mirror. We've got these terrific methods, we've got gold standards, we've got, you know, I'm not suggesting you throw those things away, but because they're all still important. We know with the pandemic that there will continue to be very important questions that come along that have an accountability element to them. ESDC, Yves Gingras made reference to that. I mean, it's an automatic that there's so much money being spent that there's going to be, it's not simply the lessons learned, there will be accountability issues, etc. And, you know, maybe evaluation gets involved in that. But what you've raised and what I reflect in my that last bullet that I mentioned is more than that. So there's an added element here is we can be all things to all people, but we don't have the resources and we don't probably have the time. So how do we balance off these various roles for evaluation? I was a head of evaluation in a few different departments at federal level. It's a terribly challenging, I shouldn't use the word terribly, it's a very challenging job because you are balancing off methods resources, with a whole plate of demands, some of which are like consulting services, as Shelley Bora said at FAC. And then there are these broader ones. So how do you basically use this function? We need to have conversations like that as well, but we need to have the conversations with the potential users. And you know, I do the work I've done the work in developing countries where there's little or no evaluation capacity. And some of the things that I think on when I come back to Canada makes me think we need to do more of this, in particular at other levels of government. And so I would say a provincial level of government is so important in this country. There's far too little evaluation. This needs to be a priority area to get energized.
Yeah, I would agree. And Bob, you touched on exactly some of the barriers that were brought up in that other conversation as well, being kind of restrictive systems and rigidity in consulting contracts, or rigidity in specific indicators that are easily monitored, and those sorts of things. So there absolutely needs to be some change in thinking that way. But noticing that Chi has a question as well. One of the other things that was brought up, and I think you're alluding to, is this concept of adaptive management functions. And an adaptive management approach is actually required. And
this is now evaluative thinking.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I'll leave it there so that you can respond to other questions. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah, great question, Nancy, and good conversation. As you mentioned, Chi has a question. Hi, Chi. Nice to see you online today. So Chi is asking, what might be some tips on change management to move M&E forward?
Wow, that's a simple one. Tips on change management to move. Well, you know, if you hear the word change management, to me, there's a real market for evaluation, because change. You're looking forward. What are the appropriate changes? Why do changes need to be made? What's the nature of those changes? I'll use a concept. Notions of theory of change, but let's put it in the John Main approach, and we'll have it in a complex environment. The theory of change is getting bad press these days, and I'm not about to give up on it, because I think that John Main's approaches allow for the complexity. But so notions of theory of change, I think, can be particularly useful. I'm sorry for this, there's a phone ringing, I can't address it, but particularly useful in, here, let me just, sorry, okay. Senior officials, typically with a change management exercise, want to know how it's going. Elements such as, again, using old words, formative, process, evaluation, become particularly important, because they're all about the learning. If you're talking about what is needed, or tips on how to bring evaluation in, change management exercises are usually initiated by senior folks. So it may require ensuring that evaluation is at the table. and that's not a small item. That's a critical item, and it's an item that, again, as we heard from the three federal heads of evaluation, being at the table and understanding the needs of your clients were the two key areas that they felt were particularly important. Lots could be said on this. I'll just stop there. But so in other words, coming at it from both the macro point to ensure that there's evaluation is part of the discussion in thinking about change management and the ways it can be assisting, and then the more micro is actually being able to deliver and deliver on time, and so. In today's world, delivering on time means that you're probably providing information that you deem to be good enough, as opposed to something in previous years you might have said, we because of the risks, etc., we need to have more assurance. Well, in today's world, maybe good enough, and you reflect and identify any risks that may be at play. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, good tips, Bob. And one thing that I'm hearing in what you're saying too is just the importance of awareness. That's something I've heard kind of throughout your talk, is making sure people are aware, the senior officials, whoever it might be that we're working with, aware of evaluation and what it can do, that it's not just one thing. As a young and emerging evaluator, I mean, I feel like I was trained when I was in school to understand kind of the forward-looking piece of evaluation, but it's taken some time for me to understand that other people don't see it as that. And I had worked with someone at one point who said they didn't want to be involved with evaluation because it just looks at things that have already been done, and that was their understanding of it. So
And I think what I've discovered in terms of consultations I've done here in Canada and other countries, the most senior person in an organization actually wants the tough questions asked, wants all of it, wants to do the things oftentimes that we think, gee, they need to be done. It is so if I think within a federal department, that would be the deputy minister. And where the problems sometimes are encountered is at the next level down, the assistant deputy minister. And because any kind of evaluation might be interpreted as a challenge to their authority, to their credibility, to their performance. And so that's kind of an interesting one. I've seen it many times. So the discussions I've always had with deputy ministers and very senior officials in countries is it's always been very open, very candid, and it works well.
awesome, that's great. And seeing that we're at 1 o'clock now, I think we could go on for a while, but this is all time that we've got budgeted, unfortunately. So I would like to turn things over to Maria Tendencia just to close things off, please.
Great.
I think I saw Maria on the line. Are you there? Oh, she was, but she's gone now, I think. And I don't see Peter. Could I turn things back over to you then, Kayreen? Next person up.
Thank you. Maria knew that it was difficult because she had a briefing with her minister or something today. Too bad, because she and I have worked on our professional development committee together, and it's been great. So Bob, thank you very much for giving us this talk at a time when life is really busy for you. I know that I felt guilty when I heard of us moving in when you've got to get this chapter out to Ray Wrist and so on, but I think it has been an important message for Nova Scotia for both our chapter, because I think I've heard some talk around this line of saying, when is the chapter going to get out and sort of do some advocacy work? So you've certainly reinforced that. So thank you. Very nice of you. I think we all appreciate your effort, your contribution. Thank you.
Thanks, Corrine. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank Evan for the support both of you have given in terms of being able to do this. So it's great. It's my pleasure.
Okay. Until next time.
Till next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take
Bye.
care.